The mud at Creston Flats was the color of old rust, and it had already swallowed Adara's good boot to the ankle by the time Hadwell finished reading her faults aloud. He had done it methodically, the way a man catalogues spoiled goods before sending them back. He stood in front of the general store, right there on the main street, with the October wind cutting off the Rockies, and half the town pretending not to watch, and he listed her deficiencies one by one. Too thin, not the girl in the photograph she'd sent, lines around her eyes, hands too rough for a parlor woman. Adara was 29 years old. She had spent those years nursing a father through 2 bad winters, keeping a boarding house ledger in Guelph after he died, and finally answering an advertisement in the Gazette that had promised a good man and a fresh start in the Northwest Territories. The advertisement had not mentioned that the good man's name was Hadwell, that Hadwell was a business partner of the most powerful speculator, or that the definition of a good man in Creston Flats was apparently a man who could humiliate a woman in public without raising his voice. "I paid your rail passage," Hadwell said, folding the photograph she'd sent, and tucking it back into his coat pocket with a kind of surgical finality. "Consider us squared. I suggest you find yourself a boarding house before dark, although—" He looked her over one more time. "Looking like that, they may not take you either." He walked away. His boots were clean. Hers were ruined. Adara stood very still for a moment on the boards outside the general store, listening to the wind, listening to the low murmur of people who had watched and were now exchanging glances. A woman by the flour sacks went back inside. A man on the opposite walk turned away. The world continued its business with her, standing in the middle of it like a post with no fence attached. She had $4.60 in the inside pocket of her coat. The boarding house across the street had a sign in the window, $6 weekly in advance. She had no return ticket. She had, truthfully, nothing to return to. That was when her legs went, not from weakness, exactly. More from the simple arithmetic of it, the adding up of every decision she had made over the past 18 months that had led her to this specific mud, this specific cold, this specific man's retreating back. She sat down on the edge of the general store steps, slowly, as though she could do it with dignity. She could not. The carpetbag went sideways into the mud, and she let it go. "Nobody will have me," she said. Her voice came out quiet and without drama, which was somehow worse than if she had cried. It was a statement of fact, delivered to no one in particular, and the grey October sky in general. Nobody will have me. She had not heard the footsteps approach. The boards were too noisy with wind, and her own pulse was too loud in her ears. The shadow fell across her first. It was a large shadow. Adara looked up, expecting a constable or a solicitor or the boarding house woman come to tell her she couldn't sit there. What she got instead was a man who looked as though he had been assembled out of the Foothills themselves. Broad across the shoulders, heavy coat that smelled of pine resin and cold air, a beard threaded with early grey, and eyes the colour of river ice. He was not a clean man. He was not a town man. He carried an axe handle over one shoulder the way some men carry umbrellas. He was looking past her at Hadwell's back, disappearing around the corner. He stood there for a moment, reading something in the distance that Adara could not see. Then he looked down at her. His voice was low, not gentle exactly, considered. "She's with me," he said. He said it to the street, to the woman who had gone back inside but was watching through the window, to the man on the opposite walk who had turned back around when the shadow appeared, to the general shape of Creston Flats, which had watched a woman be discarded and done nothing about it. Adara stared at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked down at her carpetbag in the mud and picked it up without being asked. He handed it to her. "But you don't know anyone else here either, and it's going to be below freezing in 2 hours. Can you ride?" It was not the conversation she had expected to be having. "Yes," she said. Good, he said. There's a chestnut mare at the hitching post. Get on her. Walked toward the store. Adara sat in the mud for 3 more seconds, watching him go. Then she stood up, pulled her boot out of the rust-colored mud with a sound like an argument ending, and walked to the hitching post. His name was Wolfe. She learned that much in the first hour, because he volunteered exactly 2 pieces of information during the ride north: his name, and the fact that it would take 2 days to reach the property. He did not explain what the property was. He did not explain why he had claimed her off the street like a piece of dropped cargo. He rode ahead of her on a big grey gelding and let the foothills do his talking for him. The foothills were eloquent. She would give them that. The aspens had gone full yellow, shivering in the wind off the peaks, and the sky above the ridgeline was the kind of cold blue that made everything look recently scrubbed. After the noise of the train and the humiliation of the main street and the arithmetic of her $4.60, the quiet was almost violent. Adara rode. She catalogued her situation. She had essentially agreed to follow a stranger into the wilderness based on the fact that the alternative was a mud puddle. She was aware this was not an ideal decision. She made it anyway. The property revealed itself on the afternoon of the 2nd day, as the trail dropped into a narrow valley, where a cold running creek split the spruce flat. It was a trading post, a solid, squat building of squared logs, with a plank-sided warehouse attached, a small stable and a corral where 3 horses stood and watched them come in with the mild interest of animals that had seen stranger things. There were no other people, just the creek, the horses, the spruce trees, and the smoke coming straight up from in the windless cold. Inside was worse than she'd expected, and better than the mud. "I'll explain what I need," Wolfe said. He took off his coat and hung it on a peg and sat at a table that was completely buried under papers, receipts, tally sheets, and 3 empty coffee tins serving as paperweights. "I run the post, furs and dry goods, mostly. Supply runs to the placer camps over the ridge. I go through a lot of supplies. My accounts are—" He paused, looking at the papers. "Difficult." "Difficult," Adara repeated. "I can track a moose for 4 days across granite. I cannot track where $40 of salt pork went between June and September." He said this without embarrassment. It was simply the truth. "I need someone who can find it. I need the house kept. I need orders written correctly. In the spring, when the pass clears, I'll buy you a first-class ticket to wherever you choose and pay you $200 for your time." Adara looked at the papers. She looked at the log walls. She looked at the fire in the hearth, which was the most warmth she had felt in 4 days. $250, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those river ice eyes. "Done," he said. His name for the deal was a contract. Adara's name for it, privately, was survival. She had survived things before. She began the next morning. The post was not dirty, so much as thoroughly neglected. Wolfe was a man who knew exactly how to live in the wilderness and had no idea whatsoever how to live in a building. Adara swept and scrubbed and reorganized with the systematic ferocity of someone who has been handed a problem and is grateful to have a problem to hold on to. By the end of the first week, she could find anything in the supply room in under a minute. By the end of the second, she had organized the receipts by date, supplier, and category, and built 3 separate columns that told 3 separate and contradictory stories. She found the discrepancy on a Wednesday night by lamplight, with Wolfe sitting on the other side of the hearth, sharpening a knife. The sound of the whetstone was a steady rhythm against the wind in the spruce tops. "Wolfe," she said. The whetstone stopped. "Your supply runner," she said. "Sims." He set the knife down on his knee. "What about him?" "He's charging you for delivery weights that don't match your consumption records. Not by accident." She stood up, brought the ledger to him. She had laid it out carefully. 4 columns, the discrepancy made visible so clearly that even a man who could track moose but not salt pork would see it immediately. He's been sending a portion of each delivery to the placer camp over the North Ridge, selling it separately. Your supplies his profit, since at least March. The temperature in the room dropped without the fire changing at all. Wolfe looked at the ledger for a long time. His jaw was set so hard the muscle showed through the beard. Then he looked up. "You're sure?" he said. It was the same tone he would use to ask if the trail was washed out, quiet, direct, requiring an honest answer. "Arithmetic doesn't invent things," Adara said. She held his gaze. She had been spoken over by enough men in her life that she had learned to hold her ground in the silences. "He's taken close to $160 from you since spring." Wolfe closed the ledger and handed it back to her. He stood up. He took his coat off the peg. "Bar the door," he said. "I'll be back before morning." He was. The next day, Sims's horse was gone from the corral, and Wolfe came in for breakfast, looking like a man who had walked a long way in cold air and considered the walk to have been worth it. He sat down. Adara put a plate in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "From now on," he said, "you sign every supply order. Nothing moves in or out of this post without your mark." It was not a compliment. It was a decision. And that, Adara would think later, was the moment something shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but in the way that glaciers shift. Invisibly and at enormous pressure, and in the direction of a place you hadn't planned on going. November came in hard, the pass iced over and the world contracted to the valley, the creek, the spruce flat, and the post. They fell into the rhythm that isolation imposes on people who share a space, honestly. Each knowing where the other was without asking. Each leaving room for the other's silence, each coming to trust the sound of the other's footsteps in the dark the way you trust a familiar heartbeat. Wolfe spoke more than she'd expected. Once he'd decided she was worth speaking to. He spoke about the land, the way the creek ran different in every season, the particular patience required for trapping, the history of the valley that the Cree traders had given him piece by piece over years of commerce. He did not speak about himself, but she came to understand him from the edges. From the books on his shelf worn flat with rereading, from the way he checked the horses every morning regardless of weather, from the small grave marker at the tree line she never asked about, but never forgot. In December, a falling branch caught him across the shoulder. He came in from the woodpile with his arm at a wrong angle and blood seeping through his coat, and Adara had the water on the boil before he'd finished explaining what had happened. She stitched the gash with steady hands. He watched her while she worked, which she found disconcerting because most men looked away when they were hurting. "You don't scare easy," he said. "I spent 3 years caring for my father through a long illness," she said. She tied off the suture with more force than was strictly necessary. "Blood stopped troubling me around year 2. "You're angry," he said. "I'm not angry." "You tied that knot like you were angry." She looked up. He was close. She had been leaning over him to reach the wound, and the fire was behind her, and for a moment there was nothing in the room but the specific quality of his attention, which was not like anyone else's attention. Most people looked at Adara and saw what she wasn't. Wolfe looked at her and seemed to be paying close attention to what she was. She stepped back. She put the needle away. "The branch came from the north side of the woodpile," she said, her voice entirely level. "The dead ones always fall north. Don't stand there." "I'll remember that," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had come to recognize as the nearest he got to a smile. She did not think about it after that. She thought about it constantly. Spring made itself known in the slow and grudging way of the northern foothills. First in the sound of water moving under the ice, then in the mud, then in a particular quality of light that made the spruce look as though they'd been rinsed. The pass road cleared the first week of April. Wolfe set an iron box on the corner of the table, 3 days before the first supply wagon was due. He did not say anything about it. He went out to the corral. Adara opened it, $250 in gold, her passage, plus payment, exactly as agreed. She closed the lid and stood at the table for a long time. She thought about Ontario, the grey row of houses, the boarding house ledger. The particular loneliness of a city that is busy in every direction except toward you. She thought about the Gazette advertisement that had brought her north. She thought about the mud at Creston Flats and Hadwell's voice reading her deficiencies to the October wind. Then she thought about the iron box and the fact that Wolfe had put it there, not as a goodbye, but as a confirmation that the choice was hers. She had not made many real choices in her life. She was still thinking about this one when the sound of horses came up the valley trail. There were 2 of them, a constable in a red sarge coat, and behind him a man in a town suit whose boots were wrong for the Foothills, and whose expression was wrong for a social call. His name was Fawcett. She had heard it twice. Once in Creston Flats, in the context of who owned what. Once from Sims, the day she'd found the ledger discrepancy, in the context of who Sims would run to. She understood, watching Fawcett swing down from his horse and look at the post with proprietary assessment, that Sims had run. Fawcett pushed through the door with the confidence of a man who had never been told that property belongs to the person who built it. He looked at Adara with the same cataloguing efficiency that Hadwell had used in October, and apparently came to the same conclusion. Useful, possibly, but not a threat. "I need to speak to the landowner," he said. "State your business," Adara said. "I sign the orders here." Fawcett looked at her for a moment, with the expression men used when they were recalibrating. "There's a conduct clause in the territorial land grant," he said, apparently deciding to recalibrate in the direction of condescension. "Requires the holder to maintain lawful arrangements on the property. A man and an unmarried woman, alone up here. The magistrate is prepared to view that as a violation. I've filed a complaint. The land goes to review, unless the arrangement is regularized, or she leaves." He thought he was presenting a problem. He did not know that he was confirming one. The door opened. Wolfe came in from the stable, tracking mud across the clean floor Adara had just swept, which meant he was moving without thinking, which meant he had heard some portion of it from outside. He walked to the table. He did not look at Fawcett. He opened the top drawer and removed a folded piece of blue paper. He set it on the table in front of Adara. She looked at it. She opened it. It was a territorial marriage certificate, stamped by the magistrate at Fort Macleod, dated 6 weeks ago, filed by post. Her name was on it. So was his. "That's my wife," Wolfe said. His voice was exactly the same as when he had said, "She's with me in Creston Flats." Low, flat, not arguing. Stating geography, and she is the signing authority on this property's accounts. If you have documentation regarding the land grant, you'll send it through the territorial office in writing, and she will review it. He looked at Fawcett for the first time. "Get off my land." Fawcett left. The constable went with him, looking relieved to have an excuse. The door closed. The room was very quiet for a long moment. The creek ran outside. The fire settled. Adara looked at the paper in her hands. She looked at Wolfe, who was standing with his back against the closed door, with the expression of a man who has done what he determined needed doing, and has not yet decided whether he regrets it. "When did you do this?" she said. Her voice was quiet, the quiet of contained water. "February," he said. "When Sims left, I knew he'd go to Fawcett. Fawcett needed a legal angle, and the conduct clause was the obvious one." He met her eyes. He did not apologize. "I filed by post. The magistrate accepted proxy." "You used my name," she said, without asking. "Yes." "You signed a legal document on my behalf." "Yes." Adara set the paper down on the table. Very carefully, the way you set down something you might need again. I spent my life, she said, and her voice was no longer contained, being moved around by men who decided my situation for me. My father decided I would nurse him. The boarding house owner decided I would keep his books for half what a man would earn. Hadwell decided I was insufficient, and said so to the entire street. She stopped, steadied. And you decided you would file a marriage certificate without telling me, and call it protection. It was protection, Wolfe said. I know that, she said, louder now. That is what makes it so difficult, because the right thing done without asking is still done without asking, and I am so tired. Her voice broke slightly on the word, and she hated it for breaking, but she let it. I am so tired of not being asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close, not touching. The money in the box, he said, was always yours. I put it there in February, the same day I filed the papers, so you would know that if you stayed because you chose it, not because the pass was closed, not because you had nowhere else to go. He paused. I couldn't make you stay. I could only make sure that if you went, it was because you wanted to, and if you stayed. Something moved behind his eyes that was not the careful, managed expression he wore for the rest of the world. I needed it to be a choice. Adara looked at him, at the grey threading his beard, at the hands that had built 3/4 of what she could see in this room with the specific patience of someone who had decided to make something permanent in a place that didn't ask you to. You are a terrible bookkeeper, she said. I know, he said. And you made a decision that was mine to make. I did. And you are not going to pretend otherwise. No. She picked up the marriage certificate from the table. She looked at it for a moment, her name in black ink next to his, stamped by the Fort Macleod magistrate on a cold February day, when she had been in the next room and had no idea. Then she set it back down. Ask me now, she said. He was still for a moment. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Will you stay? He said. It was not shaped like most questions. It had too much weight in it for a question. It sat in the room like a log set square, solid, taking up the space it was supposed to. Outside, the creek ran fast with the spring melt. The spruce dripped in the pale afternoon light. Somewhere up the north ridge, a varied thrush was singing the particular note it saves for the first real warmth of the year. Adara thought about the iron box and the ticket it would buy. She thought about the grey row of houses in Ontario. She thought about the boarding house ledger. She thought about the ledger she had built here instead, the one that balanced, the one that had caught the thing bleeding money from what Wolfe had spent a decade building. She thought about the small, grave marker at the tree line, and the books worn flat from rereading, and the way he stood in the stable every morning talking to the horses, in a voice too low to hear. She thought about the word home, which she had not been able to use honestly in reference to any place since she was 11 years old. Yes, she said. His hand came up. Slowly, the way he moved when he was being deliberate, and he tucked a piece of hair behind her ear with 2 fingers and the specific gentleness of a man who knows the difference between holding something and gripping it. The pass opened fully the following week. With it came the next supply wagon, and on the wagon, under a tarpaulin in the back, they found what they'd been looking for. A ledger in Sims's handwriting, listing 37 transactions between himself and Fawcett's Land Company, paid in goods taken from Wolfe's supply stock. It was, as Adara had suspected since February, not a casual theft. It was a systematic campaign to drain the post until it couldn't sustain its land grant, so that Fawcett could file a claim on the valley. The territorial constable who came for Sims 2 days later was a different one from the man Fawcett had brought. Older, with less patience for town politics. He read the ledger in Wolfe's kitchen, drinking Adara's coffee, and he used the word conspiracy twice before he finished the first cup. Fawcett was removed from his position on the Land Council before May. Sims went to Stony Mountain. The valley stayed in Wolfe's name, which by then was also Adara's name, written in black ink, and stamped by the Fort Macleod magistrate on a February day she had not known about, and now carried as her own. The summer came in green and enormous. The creek dropped to its summer level, and the horses got fat on the hillside grass, and the trading post ran clean and straight in the account books, every figure accounted for, every supply weight matching what arrived at the door. Adara hired a Métis woman from the valley to help with the post 3 days a week, and taught her the ledger system, and found that teaching something made you understand it better yourself. In the evenings they sat on the south-facing side of the post, where the last of the day's warmth collected in the logs, and Wolfe told her more about the valley, the way it had looked when he first came into it 12 years ago, with a pack horse and a letter of land intent, knowing no one and planning to stay regardless. He had built the post a log at a time, over 2 winters alone. He had never, he said, thought much about what he was building it for. Exactly. He had thought about what he was building it from. There is a difference. Adara understood the difference. She had been building for most of her life. Away from the boarding house ledger, away from Guelph, away from the accumulated weight of being a person that no one had thought to ask. She had not expected to stop running by arriving somewhere. She had not expected to look up one morning and realize that she had been here for 8 months, and had not once looked at the door to calculate the distance to it. She looked at Wolfe beside her, on the step, his big hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching the light leave the peaks. "Nobody will have me," she had said to the mud at Creston Flats, to the grey sky, to no one in particular. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about a number of things, as it turned out, and she had learned to be grateful for every one of them. The valley kept its own time. The aspens would go yellow again in October, and the creek would ice over, and the supply wagons would stop coming, until the spring thaw, and the world would contract once more to the valley and the post and the 2 of them, and the particular silence that had stopped being empty somewhere in the first hard winter, and had become, instead, the sound of something full. She was home. She had chosen it. That was the part that mattered, not the certificate, not the gold in the iron box, not the arithmetic of having nowhere else to go. She had looked at the open pass, and the ticket it promised and the space it offered, and she had stayed anyway. Stayed because the ledgers balanced here. Stayed because the creek ran different in every season and she wanted to know all of them. Stayed because of the way he asked a question like he was setting something solid into the ground and intended it to last. Some things are not found at the end of a train line. Some things you ride 2 days into the foothills to find, in a valley no one thought to put on a map, with a man who doesn't speak unless he means it, sitting in the last of the autumn light with a cup going cold between your hands and no reason on earth to go anywhere else.